Okay, last time we were looking at the fact that in uh, the 1688 sees the Glorious Revolution. James II is kicked out, and uh, William of Orange becomes the constitutional king of England. Henceforth, uh, of course, the king remains. There is a nobility, there is a church, but the reality is the parliament, which is controlled by the middle class, now uh, is sovereign in the English state. And this change in the superstructure means that capitalism can surge forward. The obstacles to further capitalist development um, uh, have been removed, and enclosures can proceed. The absolute right to property is accepted by the courts, and England experiences a huge economic surge forward in the 18th century. This period is sometimes called the Commercial Revolution. It's European wide, but England is the leader, and of course, it has this enormous political power as well. And so, what we see is that there are these two thinkers that I was beginning to talk about at the end of the last lecture, John Locke and Adam Smith, who basically rationalize what is happening. They develop an ideological framework uh, for explanation. And ideological frameworks are very important in societies, and no less than this emerging capitalist society in England. And this ideology that these two people, Locke and Smith, elaborated is known as liberalism. Liberalism. So, really, I'm giving you the basic premises of liberalism, and of course, it had a profound effect. It fully established itself in the 19th century, and we're still living in the shadow of liberalism. And indeed, we're experiencing a neoliberalism. We have experienced a neoliberalism. I'll have a little bit more to say about that toward the end of this little discussion. And so we start with Locke, and Locke lived uh, right contemporaneously with Isaac Newton, the scientific revolution. And the basis of truth is empirical observation and a reason, particularly mathematical reason, according to Newton. And uh, Locke himself, and indeed Smith, were deeply affected by this so-called scientific revolution. So, what did Locke have to say? Well, he's writing just as the Glorious Revolution is happening, and he's trying to sort of give a apology, a rationalization for why there was this political change, why the Stuarts were overthrown, why James II lost his throne, and the establishment of this new constitutional order. So he begins by talking about where do people get their knowledge, and I explained that Locke said that, following Francis Bacon earlier, that knowledge comes from empirical observation of the world. And it is only from observation of the world that people get their knowledge. They do not get it through preconceived ideas, tradition, custom, religion. No, all of these things are, in a sense, insofar as they have any truth in them, are the product of our experience. And particularly if we're looking for certain knowledge in this world, it has to be based on our empirical observation. Now, that's the first premise. And the second premise was that society, in a way, is a contract. Society is a contract. Individuals come together and they agree together. They make a contract based on their individual rational self-interest. Their individual rational self-interest is the basis on which they enter society. And in particular, according to Locke, in terms of rational self-interest, human beings have an interest in protecting their property rights, their right to property, which, according to him, is a natural right. Property is people vest their efforts, their labor, in acquiring property, and this is their rational self-interest is to maintain and indeed increase their property. And on this basis, on the basis of this rational self-interest, they contract into a society. And indeed, a proper society, a just society, is one where people are allowed to pursue their rational self-interest, to develop themselves, to develop their capacities, and acquire more property. And so, if it should come about, given this original contract by which society emerges, that the government basically blocks, inhibits, prevents this pursuit of rational self-interest, a government that does that, that interferes or even threatens, takes away people's property and so on, and there are other rights, no doubt, then it is legitimate for people to basically refuse to accept the authority of the government and to seek and eventually to overthrow that government. And so this was Locke's view, and he, I would say that this is essentially a rationalization for the Revolution of 1688. That's what he was doing in elaborating these ideas. But of course, these ideas in the aftermath, they were very influential. They were fundamental, for example, to the American Revolution, and likewise to the French Revolution. Locke's ideas about government and the basis of it were, when the later American Revolution and the French Revolution, Locke's ideas played a central role. And now I want to make clear that Locke was not a Democrat. Democrats were extremely rare at this time. People who believed that everybody should have political rights. That was not. Locke's view was that political rights should be enjoyed by people who were rational and who had a stake in society, who had some property. People who did not have property or had very little property, people like that tended to be irrational and not responsible people, and therefore they should not have property rights. And I think this is important to say because liberalism began as basically it was not a democratic idea from a political point of view. It's only in the course of time, and particularly in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the later development of the laboring classes, that democracy democracy was associated with liberalism. It was, in fact, only in the United States, which was at that time considered to be the most advanced country in the world. Democracy only happened in the United States in the 1840s. You could say that the United States became a seriously democratic state in the 1840s. And in England, not until 1884. And in France, not until 1871. So liberal democracy just emerges basically in the 19th century. And here we have Locke writing at the end of the 17th century. No, he doesn't have any sense of democracy. Now, I want to criticize Locke briefly. First of all, his idea of that all knowledge comes from experience. Let's take the case of a leaf, which is its fall, and a leaf falls from a tree and falls to the ground. It's brown. So we perceive that leaf. But when you think about it, and here I'm citing Hegel, the German philosopher, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, he wrote a critique of Locke and of empiricism, and he said basically this, that yes, there's a leaf on the ground and so on, but in order to understand, or to when we perceive the leaf, in fact, what we see is actually, it's certainly, we do see it, but the leaf lying on the ground, fallen from the tree, we perceive it in a context. We always perceive what we perceive in a context. And as he put it, the context is a coming together of many determinations. To take the leaf, the color of the leaf has to be understood in terms of the physics of light and color. It has to be perceived on the basis of the physics of the law of gravitation, because it falls. It has to be understood in terms of the science of botany. We have to understand the climatological conditions, the principles that lie behind, the climatological principles that lie behind the whole concept of the seasons. And so what he's saying is that, yes, we see the leaf, but the leaf is set in a certain kind of context. And similarly, all our other perceptions, whatever our perceptions are, have to be analyzed on the basis of the coming together or the confluence of these many determinations. So the idea that simply the acquisition of knowledge just comes from immediate perception is false, is what Hegel had to say. And the second thing I want to say about this idea is, of his ideas, is his idea of the contract. Rational individuals contract and come together to constitute a social body and government. That's not really the way it works. Yes, we do exist as individuals in society, and our individuality is very important to us. But our individuality itself is shaped by the society that we live in. We can't, the idea that we are separate individuals and we just conditionally, we don't lay down conditions when we're born as an infant. We're helpless individuals, and we depend on a family, we depend on a neighborhood, we depend on a social order. We are products of the social order. He's got it reversed. It's a society that basically shapes the individual. Not to say that individuals, as they mature and so on, they act in society, and that's very important. But certainly, society is posterior to the individual. Uh, Locke basically is presenting a doctrine, a theory, which basically looks at society as a kind of a marketplace. That's his thought is being shaped by this basic idea that society is a marketplace, and that is all there is to it. The reason I am presenting this critique is because we live in a society which is liberal, and these principles are still very important. But you should understand that uh, they are not eternal principles. They are not ultimate truths. They are the product of a certain time and a certain social order, and they have to be understood in that way. Now, of course, today, to give you an example of to deepen our understanding, today we live in a society which is not merely liberal, but it is neoliberal. That is, neoliberal means the coming back of liberalism. And what is our society coming back from? It's coming back from a society in which the state played a huge role. That is to say, in the at the end of the 1920s, there was a complete collapse of capitalism. Capitalism absolutely collapsed. And as a result of that, capitalism was saved by the massive intervention of the state, including huge amounts of military spending, World War II. That is the way capitalism got out of its crisis. And the welfare state came into being. However, starting in the 1970s, because of the balance of social forces in the society that we live in, the really wealthy people basically got control of the government, got control of the media, the education system, and they instituted something called neoliberalism, which basically has progressively dismantled the welfare state. This is the way we're living now. Less and less government intervention on the premise that society works best with minimal government interference, society and the economy. But in order to do this, Locke has this idea that somehow the government that the government has to be limited and so on. But when we see neoliberalism, what we see is an increasingly coercive kind of state. The police, the government, in order to enforce liberal ideology, is increasingly controlling and coercing the citizens. The buildup of the police, the buildup of surveillance in our society, the buildup of the military in our society, the increase in foreign wars that we're seeing. The state, in order to continue with a market society, is becoming increasingly oppressive in individual lives. I'll leave it there at that point. So I'm saying, yes, Locke, and understand Locke and understand liberalism in its context, but really, you have to be critical when you confront these ideas. And the second, now we're coming to Adam Smith, who reinforced the ideas of Locke at the end of the 18th century. We can say Locke lived at the beginning, and Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations in 1776. And what Smith did was basically he argued that he argued for laissez-faire economics, minimal government. The government should keep out of the economy. And an economy works best with a minimal government interference or supervision. The idea was that economic individuals operating with a maximum of freedom could create the maximum amount of wealth in society. If you interfered, and of course, remember mercantilism, which was invented by the Dutch and the French at the end of the 16th century, which was a kind of government-supervised kind of capitalism. This kind of capitalism was weak. But if you got rid of the government, then the economy would grow. It already had grown substantially, but it could grow a lot faster. So this is laissez-faire economics, and it complements liberal political ideology as embodied in this philosophy of John Locke. And above all, the main point of Smith was that take away the government, reduce its role to a minimum, and you depend on the market, which has its own laws. Just as Newton discovered the laws of nature, the laws of economics, the realm of economics operates according to certain laws. And the basic law, according to Smith, was supply and demand in the market. Consumers created demand, and capitalist entrepreneurs seeking profit responded by basically supplying the demands of the consumers. And this was a self-adjusting operation. It operated, there could sometimes be oversupply or insufficient demand, but ultimately the whole thing operated according to its own principles. And the best thing that the government could do, well, they needed to protect property. You needed a system of laws. You needed a police. You needed sort of an army to protect the state. But that was it. The government should not interfere. The government's role should be minimal. This was, so there's Locke's political philosophy and Smith's economic philosophy. Now, as a matter of fact, England had developed as a capitalist economy from the 16th century into the 18th century, with the state playing a very important role. And it continued to play an important role in the 18th century. Mercantilism continued to exist. The government in England, it pursued a policy of protectionism. Foreign imports were discouraged and exports were encouraged. And the government also pursued a colonialism, conquering, well, we've seen what they did with India and the Ottoman Empire and with China. So the government was doing a lot, and it was largely responsible for the success of especially the growth of English manufacturers and exports. But Smith said it could still do better by basically reducing the role of the state. And eventually, when England became the top dog, by the beginning of by the 1820 or so on, indeed, Smith's principles became the reigning economic theory in England, and wherever English influence grew, developed, eventually in Canada and the United States, and these ideas of laissez-faire, that's the idea. Let things alone. And Locke's ideas and Smith's ideas became the basic principles of liberalism. And certainly in the 18th century, as time wore on, these ideas spread to the what became the United States. They spread to France, and they do lie behind the French Revolution, the leading edge of the French Revolution, the leading edge of the American Revolution, embody the ideas that I'm speaking about, as we'll see. Now, okay, this is what I had to say about the birth of liberalism. I want to now talk about, I'm changing the subject. I want to come back to this military revolution that I spoke about earlier. I remember back, I guess, when I was speaking about the Dutch and the English at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. I spoke about the military revolution, but by the 18th century, it had become extremely important. And the more so because, as in the previous centuries, war was very important in the 18th century. And in particular, in terms of European history, the most important feature of these wars, they involved all of the powers, but the main rivalry was between the French and the English. We're talking about Louis XIV and then his successor, Louis XV, Louis XVI, France in the 18th century, and then England, this constitutional monarchy and capitalist country in the 18th century. And what we see is the continuation of this rivalry. And the rivalry is about, the conflict is basically about who is going to control the high seas and the great global areas of the world, India, North America, the Middle East, eventually Africa, this rivalry between the English and the French. And so there are a series of wars during the 18th century. We can call them colonial wars. There was war, I'm just giving you some dates to give you a sense, 1727 to 34, 1756 to 63. That's the moment that Canada is transferred from France to England. That's the time when the English conquer India, that war, 1756 to 63. Then there is the American War of Independence, 1776 to 83. And then finally there are the French Revolutionary Wars, 1793 to 1815. So a large part of the 18th century, there's war. War is going on. And in order to have these wars, government need huge amounts of money. And so what you see is that the bureaucratic tax system becomes extremely important. And not only between these two countries, but also the other big countries like Austria and Russia, which is an emerging power by this point. And in Germany, there's a new state that is becoming powerful, known as Prussia. Germany is a divided country, but a big power is emerging, Prussia. So we have Prussia, Russia, and Austria. We have France and England. And all of them are developing this sort of bureaucracy, and especially tax bureaucracy, in order to have these wars. Because whether you're going to become more or less powerful depends on how well you do in these wars. And it turns out that it is the English state, with its powerful capitalist economy and its constitutional parliamentary government, which is able to raise the most money from population. As a matter of fact, England is highly taxed, but the people who matter accept taxes because the wars that England are fighting are economic wars, they're colonial wars, and they're opening up all kinds of economic opportunities. They're conquering markets. And so England, in fact, um, is a fiscal state, and it's getting stronger and stronger in the 18th century. Ultimately emerged from these wars as absolutely dominant by 1815. England is at the very summit of its powers. But also, we see that, and we've already mentioned this, for example, as regards the Ottoman Empire is fading, and these new states like uh, uh, Russia and Austria centered on Vienna, and Russia centered on St. Petersburg, have developed fiscal systems and powerful bureaucracies and armies, and they are attacking and driving out the Ottomans from the greater part of Europe. They have this capacity. We see that using uh, their financial and military power, the British take over India. The British basically take over Canada in the 18th century and more or less are able to establish a dominant place in Latin America. Latin America remains in the hands of the Spanish, but really, behind the scenes, the British merchants and bankers are pulling the strings in the Spanish Empire. Um, so there's that aspect, sort of bureaucratic financial aspect. But also, we should note that very important improvements in military technology are happening as the years, the decades go by. Um, Now, we saw that in the 16th century, infantry became the main arm. Cavalry became secondary to the development of standing armies, in which infantry, using primitive rifles, was the dominant form of war. But these riflemen, the rifles were primitive and so on, and they kept getting attacked by cavalry. So the riflemen were supported by pikemen. That is to say, they would have there would be the riflemen in groups and so on, and they would be firing and reloading their weapon. But meanwhile, the enemy's cavalry would be advancing, and there had to be some way of fending them off. So there were these large pikes. There were soldiers, pikemen they were called, and they had these large spears. And when the cavalry would try to break into the infantry, they would counter with these pikes. So these standing infantry was composed of riflemen and pikemen. Well, at the beginning of the 18th century, there was a big change because the bayonet was invented. You could put a bayonet at the end of the muzzle of the rifle. You could attach it, and that would be the equivalent of a pike. And so you no longer needed pikemen. You just had infantrymen equipped with rifles. And at the same time, that is to say, the beginning of the 18th century, there's a major improvement in the firing mechanism of these rifles, because whereas earlier you had something called a matchlock, you actually carry a kind of match in order to set off the charge, the explosive, the bullet. And it was an extremely, loading and reloading was extremely cumbersome. Well, somebody invented the flintlock, which is a way of sparking the explosion in the chamber by the use of a flint. Pulling the trigger, you spark an explosion in the chamber. So the rifle is modernized. And in the course of the 18th century, the rifle makers, the arsenals, they go a step further and they begin to basically perfect interchangeable rifle components. In other words, it's no longer a question of craft production. You have the development in these arsenals of basically a factory production of rifles using interchangeable parts. And you see also the major improvements in artillery, like the what's called, first of all, the metallurgy improves. Earlier, the casting of these cannons, there would be imperfections, and the cannons, after a little bit of time, they would crack and so on. But in the course of the 18th century, the metallurgy becomes more sophisticated, and the iron and steel cannons can now bear the force of the charge without cracking. And they invent something called the elevating screw. You can turn a crank and you can raise and lower the cannon to adjust its aim. So what I'm saying is that military technology is developing apace, and you can see this finally in the ship, the men of war, the great battleships. We're still dealing with sailing vessels, but they are immensely large. And you now have naval architects, whereas before, in the 16th century, these ships were built by simple craftsmen who knew their craft, certainly, but now it's professionalized. You have naval architects who are basically now conceiving and perfecting these ships, and they are large, they're extremely seaworthy, and very formidable. And in back of this is the development of very sophisticated logistics. The governments, using their bureaucracies, they're able to move troops and equipment in very sophisticated ways. And finally, to come back to this, the states have the fiscal capacity, the taxing power. And all of this we call the military revolution. And of course, it means that these European armies can now outclass, led by the English and the French, no doubt, they can outclass everybody else. The rest of the world, however valiant people are, in the face of this kind of warfare, the Europeans are extremely well placed. Now, what I've said really, in a way, war is increasingly industrial. That's what's really going on here. And that reflects the fact that Europe, and particularly England, is on the threshold of what we call the Industrial Revolution. By the 1760s, the English capitalist economy is increasingly becoming an industrial economy. Concentrated factories using mechanical devices are first we see it in the textile industry and then spreading from one industry to the next. You have the development of the factory, concentrated production. You have the increasing investment of money capital in production, the entry of capital into production. That's what we call the Industrial Revolution. But before we get there, I want to discuss the role of slavery in the development of the Industrial Revolution. The role of slavery in the development of the Industrial Revolution. This question was raised way back in the, I guess he published in the 1930s. There was a Caribbean scholar by the name of Eric Williams, um, who wrote a book about this and basically said that the Industrial Revolution was based on the profits coming from the slave trade and the exploitation of African labor in the Americas. That the profits generated from this mode of exploitation lay behind the Industrial Revolution. Well, of course, it's a complicated question, much dispute, but this is called the Williams thesis, Eric Williams, has been largely vindicated, as a matter of fact. Yes, indeed, the commercial revolution centered on, above all, on the slave trade and plantation slavery, generated enormous profits in England, but also in France and even in Holland. And these profits were invested in the development of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, black labor produced the profits that went into the Industrial Revolution. And in what way then how did slavery sort of produce the profits that made all of this possible? Well, in the first place, of course, people made a lot of money from the slave trade and from the plantations. Sugar and coffee, etc., rice were extremely profitable, and the people who owned the plantations or were involved in the slave trade made a lot of money. And a lot of this money found its way to European banks, specifically English banks, and that money capital was loaned out to early industrialists. That was the basic mechanism by which this happened. But also, the slave plantations in the Caribbean, in Venezuela, in the American South, they needed things like cotton goods. They needed iron and steel implements in order to work the plantations. They needed all sorts of food like rice and fish and rum in order to keep the slaves going. And merchants made a lot of money basically the early industrialists sold manufactured products to the plantations. So on the one hand, the savings generated by slavery were used to build the factories in the first place, and then the factory supplied all these manufactured goods. And as a matter of fact, also, there were people already, white settlers, in the maritime provinces of Canada and in New England, the American colonists, as well as the Maritimers, who sold food products, dairy products, wheat, and rum to the Caribbean islands, to the plantations. And these people made money as well, and they bought manufactured goods from England. So a sophisticated kind of triangular trade developed. And the Atlantic economy boomed in the 18th century based on these kinds of relationships. We call this the commercial revolution, centered on the Atlantic. And slavery was at the center. It is estimated that 75% of the total value of all of the commercial products which were circulating in the Atlantic during this commercial revolution. Basically, the actual origin of all this came from the slave labor on the plantations. These calculations have been done. This is basically the relationship between slavery and the development of industrial capitalism toward the end of the 18th century. So now, to continue a little bit, I want to talk a little bit more about slavery itself and what happened to Africa as a result of their place in this Atlantic world. What happened to Africa as a continent as a result of the development of these kinds of relationships, in which the slave trade and the slave plantations in the New World played such an important role? Well, first of all, we should say that slavery was a very old institution. The Greeks and the Romans, way back, slavery was enormous in the under the Greeks and under the Roman Empire during antiquity. And then during the Middle Ages, slavery remained a significant institution. It was particularly notable in the Arab world. Slavery was, and mainly black slaves, some Slav slave, but also a lot of Africans were enslaved by the Arabs, and they were brought to the Mediterranean countries and so on. And there was a little bit of slavery in places like Italy during the Middle Ages. But actually, slavery was a well-established institution in Africa. Slavery played a big role in African society all through the Middle Ages. Now, Africa, of course, as I've explained at the beginning of the class, it had its civilizations. There was Mali, there was Ethiopia, there was the Sudan, there was Zimbabwe, there was Ghana, and a number of other highly developed countries in Africa, which had states, social classes, built monumental buildings, had kinds of writing, had Iron Age technology, etc., etc. There was trade, there were cities. Such was Africa during, especially the latter part of the Middle Ages. However, one thing that was significant about Africa, and I'll be finishing at this point, is that private property and land basically did not exist. You could not accumulate wealth as land as a form of wealth. No, land belonged to the community, and the chief was the person who basically sort of managed the land in behalf of the community. So land, there was no such thing as private property and land. Wealth was measured by how many people and their labor as an individual. There were powerful men in African society who had significant numbers of people working for them. One of these was their wives, polygamy. And the wives worked for these big guys. This is the way it worked. It was a polygamous society. Wives and children worked for the powerful father. And in addition to that, there were more or less a large number of slaves taken in war, and they also worked for these powerful men. Well, I'll finish this up in the next class.